Untitled. Finally got it. Age 95.
Thank you, citizens. It's a beautiful day. Now, on this occasion, I did prepare a few words to speak, since the Avengers elected me as being the best source on the subject of World War II, which is what you good folks wanted to hear about, as I understand. But I didn't come alone, and there is help. We are able to present some images up on the screen. And of course, we have some resources in the back, which I would welcome the young man sitting closest to be able to take one and pass it around, since that's one way you could be on CAP's junior core of Junior Avengers. So the title, How the Biggest Conflict in Human History Begat an Entertainment Industry, is what I'll be speaking to you about today. Now, I should introduce myself. My name is Stephen Grant Rogers. I was born in a precinct of Lower East Side Manhattan. Some of you guys might have been to New York before. That's my hometown. And I was born to two Irish immigrants in the Ide of summer. This was July 4th, 1920. So this marks my 100th birthday today, or this year. Well, talking about the origin of comic books, now you might be aware, comic books are, in this day and age, major blockbuster movies. They're really what drives a lot of pop culture. But at its prime, at its beginnings, I should say, comic books were, well, frankly, we were ridiculous. We were ludicrous, silly. You can see some of our beginnings right here, kind of like baby pictures in the bathtub, not much to be proud of. But I will also point out that comic books have also been the medium to be able to shine forth a lot of what we consider serious or even sacred, maybe even holy. It's a venue that accomplishes a lot. So for all of this, I want to point out, if you're looking at where comic books came from and how this is all tied in with World War II, of course, your mind goes to this year, right? This is where we enter the war. It's Pearl Harbor. It's the Day of Infamy. But I would throw back the time frame just a little bit to be able to talk about a year previous to that, when comic books get their origin. This is 1933. And what you see up on the screen is the famous Funnies. This was the first time a comic strip, which you would definitely see inaugurated in a lot of newspapers and magazines, eventually gets condensed into just one book. The name still sticks. Comic strip turns into comic books, even though the content will become adventurous, mysterious, horror-filled, not just funny and friendly. But 33 is the first time you'll ever see comic books appear on the newsstand, selling for a dime, or a nickel, most commonly, back then. The very first time you have any comic book, any comic strip at all, is this guy, P.F. Occult's The Yellow Kid. Born out of a time of yellow journalism, The Yellow Kid is not our finest moment for being politically and rationally at our best. There's quite a few racist themes that we'll talk about later on, but this was the time frame. If there's one thing Americans should be good at, it is facing our own deficiencies. This is where it all begins. So 1895 is as far back as you can go with the American history of pictures on the screen, on the newspaper stands. Well, the most recognized of all, of any comic book, any visual medium, I'll go ahead and offer this up to anyone who's in our superhero mask-wearing crowd. Can anyone take a guess? What's the most recognized symbol this world over if you discount religious symbols or national symbols on a flag? What would you take a guess?
Superman.
I congratulate you on your super insight. This symbol, second only to the Coca-Cola symbol around the world, is the most recognizable, apart from religious or national symbols around the world. And this symbol blazes onto the screen in 1938, specifically in this issue of Action Comics #1. It's stated, if you can see for the 10-cent price, June 1938. But even though Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way, his magazine editors and publishers did not. They actually published this in April in order to make a few extra bucks, published it with a June cover to make sure that, well, it'd be on the newsstand and still look new by the time people possibly didn't buy this. But people did. They bought it in huge numbers. This was a runaway train of impressive salesmanship. And Superman becomes the first superhero recognized in any comic book medium. There would be many, including myself, to follow in the years to come. And these are the two guys who made it happen. Behold, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Don't be fooled by the image once they're already famous. These were two acne pockmarked kids from Cleveland, Ohio, who had big dreams, even as their weight and relationship with girls were at an all-time low. They were two Jewish boys born in the slums, and it's their meteoric rise that we have to tell in equal parts, along with Superman's rise in the comic book world to make it what it is. These were both sons of Eastern Jewish tailors. They were packed into crowded, destitute homes, like many other hundreds of thousands in their vicinity. The Jerry Shuster, man at the top, he was of particular interest. His father, Michael Siegel, had died at the age of 60 inside of his tailor shop when two armed men came in, thrusting a pistol in his face, demanding all of his money. In the space of an instant, Michael Siegel died of a heart attack right there on his tailor store floor. That was something that a teenage Jerry would never forget, especially when designing a father figure or an older brother model that could save the day from would-be attackers. I also want to point out that the vigilante justice that was decried on the streets of Cleveland, Ohio in a local newspaper later on that month, talking about how really sometimes it's the victim's fault as to why they are attacked by hoods. That writer was known as A.L. Luthor, and his name would go on to become the main Superman villain. Jerry's boyhood crush during his high school years was a girl named Lois Amster. You can see a lot of the personal details making their way onto the serial screen and book format. On the subject of girls, both Jerry and Joe were terrified of girls, as much as any human being would be of supervillains. It's comparable. Both wore glasses, one of which you can see here, but Joe, on the bottom, was very nearsighted. He drew all of the original Superman artwork with his face 2 to 3 inches away from the page, eventually having to do 1 inch away. Both of these were instructive in creating a very vague outline of who Superman was to become, in fact, the format and template for all of us superheroes. But at the beginning, they didn't really know what to make of it. It was already in the drawing works since the early 1930s when Jerry first had his idea, but his ideas in high school actually stemmed about a supervillain who was named the Superman, obviously drawing from ideas of the Ubermensch in Nietzsche's work, about a man who develops superpowers from an evil scientist who grants him the ability to not only read people's thoughts but also control them. Eventually, Jerry thought this wasn't the best venue for a superpowered being, that it would be far better for the world to have someone to protect it than to villainize it. And so, drawing on their favorite inspirations, Jerry and Joe crafted from scratch, a superhero all of their own making. You can see here in the top left, Philip Weil's Gladiator, a man named Hugo Danning, whose skin was impervious and had super strength granted to him by his scientist father. You can see a specific good-looking actor on the top right. Anyone recognize him? He's more from my day when I'm growing up in Brooklyn, being able to see his westerns up on the screen.
Is that Randolph Scott?
Good, yes. One of his peers. That happens to be Tom Mix, the most famous western hero. You also got John Carter of Mars, who is Burroughs' fan favorite from the science fiction world, a scientific ex-Confederate who goes up to Mars and then has superpowers being granted him by Mars's low gravity, able to jump huge buildings in a single bound. Doc Savage, you might notice in the left of that magazine, known as the Man of Bronze, later on to be called the Man of Steel. Tarzan, another of Burroughs' creations. Welcome, Susan. Good to see you. Tarzan, who is known as Lord of the Apes, unequaled in strength and daring. And then, of course, Metropolis, a 1927 Fritz Lang production in Germany that guarantees the name of Superman's hometown. So, with all of these, and plus a Polish-Jewish hero to the people of Cleveland, Ohio, a traveling acrobat strongman who happened to be of the same religious stock as Jerry and Joe. This is a man known as Zisch, whose real name was Sigmund Breitbart, huge celebrity in the Jewish world for his daring acts of strength and acrobatics. But that's not all that's going on in the 1930s in places like Cleveland and New York. This is a time of calamity. Those of us with hindsight who know about World War II know what's just around the corner, but that didn't stop people from guessing as to what fate was in store for them, especially with the fact that in this time period we see a darkening sky filled with Hitler taking over territories in Europe, immigration policies where German, Jewish are pouring into this country, and the fear of what assimilation might look like. You also have Orson Welles' scare of 1938. Some of you have heard of War of the Worlds that took the nation by storm. And what needed most was a hero. And that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were just about to deliver. So imagine Jerry and Joe hitting it off like two teenage, lonely, girl-scared kids that they were, meeting inside of their apartment. Not the best of times. At one point, Jerry decides he needs somebody older, and so he goes behind Joe's back to contact more mature, more experienced artists, which has the direct result of, when Joe hears about this, tearing up the original papers of Superman, feeling betrayed by his ambitious partner. But eventually, after the months go by, they decide to reconcile and work together. Joe decides that Clark Kent would be best drawn by having Jerry, the writer, pose. So this nerd from Cleveland, Ohio, is then making poses as Clark Kent, and Joe Shuster does the drawings for that. But it's much more difficult to draw the voluptuous Lois Lane character. So they decide, hire a real actress, a model, to be able to pose in this Depression era. So imagine paying $1.50 per hour for a professional actress to come to your apartment, rather your mom's apartment, and pose in all the pictures for Lois Lane. That's exactly what happens in part. They hire an actress or a model who shows up as a skinny high school student named Joanne Kovacs, from an immigrant family herself, wearing her older sister's bathing suit, which needed to be pinned in the back since she was not big enough yet as a developing actress. She billed herself as an attractive model, but Joanne Carter was her stage name. She had only actually modeled in front of the mirror previously. And she would later be known as Mrs. Jerry Siegel in the years to come. So you can see this is a fly-by-night operation with everyone involved being a Depression-era, sorely lacking funds, trying to represent themselves as something bigger and stronger than they actually were, much like a certain Clark Kent who would be on the pictures. Unfortunately for Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they end up selling the rights to Superman for an easy $130 to the publishing company, something akin to the Dutch West Indies Company being buying the rights to Manhattan in the city that would later on support Metropolis. So eventually, this story, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel were fired from the company. after a lot of their involvement had paid off for the publishing company. A decades-long lawsuit did eventually award them with a take on the profits that they had helped to create, and they did get a lifetime supply of cash, but for a while there, it was some dirty work. Hello, citizen. Not to be confused, the Depression was not the only events that were happening during this time. As you can see, Kristallnacht would also occupy headlines. The Superman would also gather on the newspapers. This is in November of 1938, and earlier that year you would have a great hurricane sweeping through. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to say you came dressed well
Thank you.
for the occasion. This happens to be two such events that two Jewish young boys would of course be looking for a hero to fit this time, to save the world from a preaching of genocide, and also from the natural events that were wreaking havoc with humankind. Note also the year before, and present on people's minds, in New Jersey, close by, you would have the case of the Hindenburg crashing, killing many of the people on board. So how to find a hero to suit the times. Not just any hero, but also a Jewish one. Now, this has been commented on by historians and documentarists for ages. Superman being Jewish, it couldn't be. But consider a lot of the facts of the case. You have the fact that his real name, his Kryptonian name, is Kal-El. His origin story involves a baby placed inside of a container set out by his parents from a doomed origin to be able to finally reach a place of safety, adopted by a household that will then caretake him, look after him, raise him, and teach him how to exist inside of his new dwelling place, where he will grow eventually to be a savior to his people and to be their protector. One might even say entrusted by those on high to be those who can show the way to the rest of humanity. Not surprisingly, many have made mention of the Moses story along with Superman's. The authors being Jewish, the publishers being Jewish. In fact, at one point in the 1970s, more than 70% of all people working on comic books in Marvel and DC were in fact Jewish, authors and artists both. The backdrop of the war, with needing someone to fight against the Nazis, with Superman in one comic book landing a strictly non-Aryan fist on Hitler's jaw, tends to imply that there is more than just coincidence here. The S on the shirt does bear a resemblance to the Hebrew letter Lamed in its form. It's not just a regular S after all. The Mishnah, which is the written works in the 2nd century of Jewish writings, preaches that people should mostly pay attention if they are among the tzaddikim, the righteous men of this world. They should be following and pursuing truth, justice, and peace. Sounds like a very close combo related to what would later on be added. The truth and justice came before the war, during World War II, and the American way was added on. And of course, what could be more Jewish than a wandering alien making his way and trying to blend in among the local population in the ultimate act of assimilating by taking on the very Midwestern name of Clark Kent. In fact, Jerome Siegelowitz sounds very, very Jewish, but Jerry sounds a lot more American, just like Joe. So given the fact that all of this urges a sort of Jewish heightened flair to it, I should also point out that the Nazis also found this combination at one point when, in a Superman comic from the late 1930s, you had one issue, obviously a pre-American involvement in 1941. The Man of Steel visits a Deucalion American sports event in 1936, hint, hint, the Berlin Olympics. And the Deucalion Council, whose name is a German name, Karl Wolff, bearing the crest looks oddly like the German Iron Cross, gives this speech. Present here is the flower of Deucalion youth. You have seen them perform physical feats which no other human being can. Proof, I tell you, that we Deucalions are superior to any other race or nation. proof that we are entitled to be masters of America. Of course, Clark Kent is investigating this as a reporter, but he can't help himself, as the hot-blooded American that he is, to switch costumes and then quickly defeat every Deucalion athlete at his own game, humiliate Hitler, I mean Wolf, by leaving him up on the flagpole. It turns out the saboteurs, of course, are involved in the events, so Superman deals with them quickly. I might point out, I myself, in a not too subsequent Captain America comic, was even more straightforward. My issue number 1 presents my red, white, and blue features landing a kisser right on Adolf's poor face. This came a full year before our involvement in December of 1941. So, not a surprise, therefore, that Simon and Schuster are described by the Third Reich in Germany not liking their newspaper hero. One criticizing Superman as being a pleasant guy with an overdeveloped body and an underdeveloped mind, says the SS paper, accusing both men, Jerry Siegel and Superman, of sowing hate, suspicion, evil, laziness, and criminality into the hearts of American youth who don't even notice the poison they swallow daily. Also, the German-American Bund, before the war, sent Joe Shuster hate mail all the way up to the war, and its members picketed DC Comics headquarters because of Superman's supposed Jewishness. Not to be confused, though, with the fact that many Christian pastors and laymen have also laid claim to the Superman motif as a representation of their own Messiah. Case in point, you have the fact that Clark Kent's middle name is Joseph. Originally, his mother's name is Mary when she adopts him as an orphan. He is, in fact, a Messiah figure by most standards, who was sent by an otherworldly father as a baby to be Earth's guardian and bringer of hope and light, and raised by 2 mortals who taught him to be disguised among humanity until it is his time. Just adding a little bit of panache on the American cake here is the fact that the word krypton in Greek means hidden. So there's a lot more that you could go on to say about how in this day and age storytelling is very common to Jewish and Christian writers alike. For Jews newly immigrated to America, what better expression of assimilation would there be than a real-life alien who blends in with the average all-American Midwesterner coming out of Smallville, Kansas, no less. But really, he wants to belong in this new world that he loves. By 1900, hello citizen, welcome. By 1900, 40% of all American Jews were newcomers, having only existed in the country for 10 or fewer years. And in the next generation, there'd be another 1.75 million coming. One of the reasons why Superman caught on so well within the Jewish community. One testimony of many. Regardless of religious affiliation, Superman has been an inspiration to Buddhists and agnostics, atheists. In fact, those who would not even find realm in the spiritual have stated Superman's great legacy in their own life. One such individual named Emilio Ramos has this to say. I'm going to ask for one member in our audience to share this out loud. We could have a volunteer on CAPS Junior Patrol who would like to read this out loud. Yes, sir.
I've never had alcohol, never smoked, never done a drug in my life. People are surprised with that because of the environment I was exposed to growing up. People are even more surprised when they're asked how I turned out the way I am. And I just say one word: Superman.
And that is from an everyman. Thank you, citizen, for reading that out loud. Who grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, in the worst parts of that city. He later on goes on to join law enforcement, but he credits his rise out of a life where he had no male models to partner with due to Superman's influence on him. Other Superman fans, you might recognize the man in the top left. Anyone see his face before? If so, feel free to give a shout out. Who is it?
Is it Lou Gary?
Sure, Joe DiMaggio. You recognize the Yankees outfit just like I do. It's one of my growing up in Brooklyn, you can best believe, been my share of Yankees games. Joe DiMaggio, and the guy just next to him, his best friend on the Yankees team, is Lefty Gomez, right? A bit of Spain and Italy here in America. And you might be surprised to know that by 1940, 2 years after Superman splashes on the pages, you've got a story, which we don't believe is apocryphal, where Joe DiMaggio and Lefty are walking past a newsstand, and Joe DiMaggio asks, "What day is today?" And Lefty says, "Well, it's Wednesday, Joe." And Joe says, "No, it's the day that Superman comes out." And Lefty says, "What do you want me to do about it?" And Joe says, "Go down to the stand, get me a Superman magazine." And Lefty says, "Why don't you do it?" Joe says, No, I can't let people know I'm a Superman fan." Sure enough, after a couple false starts, Lefty buys the paper for him, Joe acting very nonchalant, but as soon as he goes back home, he sits down and reads that sucker through. Good to see you, citizen. So, on the Yankees fan club, we also have these two guys, and by 1940, the single biggest float at the New York parade, the Macy's parade, happens to be a full-on Superman sized balloon, which you can see here as an actual picture from 1940. Not his most impressive or flattering, but certainly you can already attest to how big Superman is, pun intended. So you might remember that 1930s is where Superman gets his start, and that should not be lost in the fact that Superman was a New Deal progressive. When he was made, you can best entertain a lot of the, shall we even say, hopeful socialist and definitely everyman politics that was going on at that time. Superman doesn't waste time with following every rule. Later on, he's going to be known as Supes, the Big S, the Big Boy Scout. But now he's not afraid of breaking down a few walls, breaking into the governor's bedroom. If there is an execution that's going to happen, someone's wrongfully accused, he's going to make sure that whatever the law says, his stream of justice is going to be beyond that. His very first villain that he fights in Action Comics #1 is in fact a wife beater, who he gives a good thrashing to before the man faints. So, not to be surprised, a lot of Superman's first villains, and Batman's, Green Lanterns, the Flashes as well, are all not supervillains or aliens from another planet, but corporate takeover, arms dealers, war profiteers, anyone who is hoping to exploit the common man. That's who Superman goes after in the very first issues. Corrupt businessmen were definitely on the list of those who were on Superman's, in his magnified sights. But all of this changes by 1941 with the arrival of America's entrance into the war, which is mostly where my numbers start to climb as well in our comic books industries. You can see Superman's brand of justice expands exponentially. This was actually a comic book that came out before our entry into the war, in which, as a hypothetical, Superman goes off to take down the two biggest baddies in the world today. There's Hitler and Stalin, and in the space of only 2 pages, Superman is able to swing into Moscow and Berlin and bring those two suckers to the halls of the League of Nations, a then still operative in name only at least, Hall of Justice, where if only the world could be cured of its evils in a super way like this. Well, because of Superman's drastic and superior techniques, his willingness to stand for the common man, you can see how little boys, teenagers, and grown-up Yankees players make for Superman to become a highest-selling manuscript in the world. And this is true by 1940. When the war began, 1 year later, 15 million comic books were being published a month. This is unheard of in today's world, where comic books are doing great if they can sell 40,000. And Superman was selling out at 1 million copies in this pulp era. 2 years later, by 1943, 25 million copies were being sold a month. Superman, and I hope it's not too modest to say, Captain America, we're selling it 1 million editions a month alone. And the largest single customer of all of these was the US Army.
Ah.
So, not surprisingly, the estimates that I've seen most reliable measure that 80% of the Army's reading material during the World War was comic books, and suits was tops. The Army originally brought comics to the troops as a diversion, not realizing that they would find a market, soldiers being hooked on storylines and character development, the virtuous fight of evil against oppression, against evil and oppression. Speaking of which, I might point out something that you might not be aware of, but it stands to reason. During the war, of course, Superman, myself, and all the rest of us heroes were accurately reflecting the sign of the times, which means that at the time, Japs and Krauts was the way that you would refer to our enemies. So a lot of accusations, rightfully, have been made about the language we used back then. Being young and new is not much of a justification for it, but at this time, this was reflective of the language that the Marines fighting in Okinawa would have used. Well, hello again. Welcome. You can see here the language used. I'll read this out loud as an indication. Good call. So Germans sometimes called Krauts or the Hun. Some of you have heard Japanese referred to as Japs or worse. Superheroes and the rest of us oftentimes use these slurs, which seem atrocious today. And believe me, almost everything about that war was atrocious. Japanese particularly seem inhuman in these World War II comics. Stories with titles like The Terror of the Slimy Japs, Funeral for Yellow Dogs, and The Slant Eye of Satan give you some idea of the fanged, buck-toothed enemies that were portrayed on these art mediums, calling them yellow punks, yellow apes, dirty yellow devils. The Germans are likewise described as an intolerant, devilish, warlike, deplorable people. Comparably ugly were also depictions of Africans, African natives specifically. Tarzan or Sheena of the jungle encountered savage tribes stupid enough to work for the Nazis, ones incapable of using pronouns, those obsessed with the urge to kill all white people. This was the medium at the time, and I wouldn't be Captain America unless I revealed all to the American people. This is what our medium was like at this time. So think twice before giving it to an impressionable youth of today, just because it's a 1941 comic. Captain America comics specifically did involve bullet holes in people's foreheads, so I want to caution you before sharing those with our youngsters. Not all portrayals of non-Americans, however, were racist. I want to point out that several superheroes, myself included, did distinguish the difference between an American with Japanese or German descent and our enemies overseas. In one of the wartime issues from 1941, when we were just getting off our feet, I do say to my impressionistic sidekick, anyone familiar with my sidekick during World War II? Bucky, of course, Jonathan Bucky Barnes. I do tell him, I've found German American people to be very nice. And in a later fight of Japanese subvertists involving Japanese Americans for their purpose, I do exonerate the Japanese Americans, letting them go, wanting them to be exposed to America's freedom rather than imprisonment, which was going on by 1941 and 42. One freed character says, I was born in America and I love this country. There are many more Japs like me. Similarly, there's another comic in a Captain America magazine called One German American who states, I am of German descent, yes, but I'm also a good American citizen. I'll have nothing to do with an organization that aims to destroy the country that protects me and mine from creeds like yours, talking to the SS. So clearly there was some division made between the good and the bad among the populations that we were fighting. Maybe not enough for some, but there were some. Less digestible is the presentation of common black characters or others from other places. Ebony stands out as the lovable sidekick of Will Eisner's The Spirit. Ebony was the typical short, pudgy black cab driver who accompanies the lighthearted superhero, even solving some of his mysteries that the Spirit cannot. But when Ebony is on vacation, he's replaced by the similarly depicted Eskimo Blubber. Not our finest renditions. In any case, all of this is to say, comic book superheroes were on the march, and we would only be getting bigger. And while it's true that the war made comic books helped the war. A good example of this, you can see not just fighting against the likes of Joseph Goebbels with the Bell of Liberty, but also the sale of war bonds, delivering supplies, doing things to help the war effort on radio, in print, just beyond fighting. There was stopping spies at home, doing whatever we could to help the soldiers who were overseas. And here you can see the many, many spin-offs of Superman. He was the very first character ever to be launched in a comic book before then being made into a comic strip. Every other character in print by the 1930s and 40s, if he was worth his salt, was a comic strip first and then made it into a comic book by collecting all those strips together. But Jerry and Joe were the two comic book writers that really wanted to make this happen on the comic book medium, and they did. Superman's success launched hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of other red, white, and blue clad superheroes. I would like to claim otherwise, but among them, most popular, Wonder Woman, created by a man, William Moulton Marsden, who is famous not only for his creation of Wonder Woman, who not only has strength in a similar vein to Superman, harkens back to mythological era like Superman, similarly attired, except for the skirt and bikini-like top, but also she is wearing her bracers of defense, which can block bullets, and carries a magic lasso, which, when used, will cause anyone gripped to tell the truth. Does anyone know what William Moulton Marsden also was the inventor of besides Wonder Woman? It's a little invention called the lie detector test.
Oh, really?
There's a doctor who invented that as well. Batman and later Robin, being the very first sidekick character to make its way on the pages of any comic book, were similarly involved in Detective Comics in making sure they did their part for the war effort. And there were many, many others. During this golden age, you can see just a collection here in the Liberty League of similar characters who make their way onto the page because of Superman's success. Clearly, not all of them live to this day. Most of us have not heard of the Black Terror, Uncle Sam, or many others that have not survived the 1940s.
Green Turtle.
Green Turtle, yeah.
Today.
True, true. And you have...
And the Freedom Fighters, yeah.
They are. However, a lot of these you will find, they narrowly escaped World War II success. By the 1950s, all of these are canceled. Subscriptions die out and drop away during a certain time called the Seduction of the Innocent, which is a chapter for another time to talk about why almost every comic book title of superhero dies out, including, sadly, my own, by 1950, with a short reprise in 1953, and doesn't make its way again until Stan Lee brings me back in 1963. The only exceptions are, of course, Superman, who has a long-standing run since 1938, and these two. They're the only three to actually make it consecutively from World War II to today. Let's talk about World War II. So, not only has Supes and other heroes become, let's call it what it is, pure propaganda for the war effort, but also it's what indelibly seals comic books' popularity for good, and with good reason. One radio broadcast appeal, just one, from Superman, brings in 250,000 young patriots to mail in pledges to buy war stamps. The British Admiralty names its most powerful ocean tugboat the HMS Superman. And you can see up here on the B-17 and the B-24 bombers, other fanboys making their way with paint in the same way Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster did. The Navy strives to end illiteracy among their ranks.
Oh, wow.
With it, in part by having the dialogue in Superman issues shaved to single or double syllable lines only.
Wow.
And then rolling out to its sailors 15,000 copies a month to be shared among ships and elsewhere. These are easy to read books. In fact, after D-Day, one anxious infantry officer is quoted telling war correspondents, "When I saw one of our boys in our landing craft nonchalantly reading a copy of Superman, I knew everything would be all right."
Wow.
So, now that popularity is on the rise, and as we can see, superheroes are doing their part. I'll mildly put a plug in for the little tap to the kisser of Mr. Schicklgruber himself. We have to point out the obvious, and that is, how was it that these comic book writers could look themselves in the mirror after doing a blatant act of what is today considered propaganda? At no other time in history do comic books become so one-minded as they do right here. But I will point out, to quote Stanley Lieberman, otherwise changing his name to a more American Stan Lee, he claims, "This is not just something that we did to sell comic books. This, we considered, was our patriotic duty." For him, for Jerry Siegel and others who were drafted into the Army, their job was to fight against the Nazis and the Japanese however they could. And they happened to have a use with their hands far better than they could with holding a gun. So while superheroes did their part, so did non-superpowered beings in comic books. You can see examples of Hop Harrigan, America's ace of the airwaves, quoted to say, again, plug your ears if you're a child, "To rap the Jap, slap on the yap, that'll corrugate his map." You have cases like the Boy Commandos taking Adolf Hitler by storm, or Black Hawk, a Polish freedom fighter turned pilot who fights against the Nazis in the Eastern Front. All of these were non-superpowered heroes. So why on God's green earth, I'm going to say one of the quotes that Captain America is known for, mother and country, how is it possible that you can have normal humans on comic book pages doing their part to fight against the powers of evil, the Axis, around the world, when you have a super-powered alien who can easily run faster than a speeding bullet, can jump buildings in a single bound? He wouldn't be able to fly until 1943. Or with impervious skin, have bullets bounce off him, not end the war in a matter of hours. That was what we call the Superman dilemma. And it was the question that was posed not just within Detective Comics, but also in such magazines as Time, who noted this distinction. And you can see here, I'm going to ask for one of us to read the bottom text at the bottom, which appears from the Time magazine. Please.
Me, as the mightiest, fightingest American, the man of steel ought to join up, but he can't. In the combat services, he would lick the Japs and Nazis in a wink, and the war isn't going to end that soon. On the other hand, he can't afford to lose the respect of millions by failing to do his bit or by letting the war drag on.
Thank you, Susan. That was perfect.
You're so welcome.
Now, I'll have you notice, and if you remember back, Joe Shuster, the original artist for Superman, had incredibly bad vision. That would come back as a saving grace for Clark Kent, who obviously wanting to do his part as any other red-blooded, patriotic American would, but not being able to because of the restrictions of plot. They contrived this scheme. Clark Kent goes into the recruiter's office. He is so eager and adamant to be able to pass his test, his PAE, his physical aptitude exam, to get in, that the doctors explain after that, yeah, sure, you're physically superb, except that you're obviously blind as a bat. When I asked you to read the eye chart aloud, you missed every line. Superman realizes he looked through that first E chart and saw the one in the next room, and therefore was dismissed as disqualified physically impaired to not be able to fight, which doesn't stop him from stopping saboteurs in Metropolis and elsewhere, and making sure that American soldiers have what they need to fight this war. As Superman puts it, every sailor, soldier, Marine doesn't need a Superman in order to defeat the Nazis, the Japanese, and the Axis. A question here, though, and this is something that some of you who know a little about World War II can answer for us. What is the designation known as when you are considered physically or medically or psychologically unfit for service? What is that designation?
4F.
4F is exactly right. And it means rejected from military service. Superman wasn't the only 4F that was rejected during World War II. I think some of these might surprise you and give you some company to put Superman in, lest there be any stigma. On this list involves for World War II none other than Ray Bradbury, vision, Paul Newman, colorblindness, he wanted to be a pilot, Julia Child, who wanted to join up the Waves and Wax, and both denied her because she was oversized. She was 6'2".
Ah.
Ben O. Davis Jr., and you might not recognize that name, but I know him. He was one of my buddies during World War II. He was in his 3rd year at West Point as a cadet, wanted to sign up as a pilot, a part of the newly emerging Army Air Corps, and was denied because he was suffering from the condition of being black. And because of that, he later on was allowed and welcomed to become a commander of a new squadron of do-nothings that the government was going to sequester away, called the Tuskegee Airmen. He later on became the commander, and rising to the rank of America's first black 4-star general, and later on the chief of staff of the same Air Force that denied him because of his skin color. Also, Audie Murphy, the most famous real-life World War II hero, most decorated, was first denied as 4F. He lied about his age at 16. Also, he was very, very small. Denied in the Navy, the Marines, and the Army Airborne. And his sister falsified his birth certificate at the age of 17 on his 17th birthday. He was so eager to get in to make it appear as he was 18, and then the Army took him. Norman Rockwell was considered 4F. He was underweight by 8 pounds, and he was only able to get in on his next evaluation because he gorged on bananas, donuts, and liquids the night before. Mickey Rooney of Judy Garland's early movies fame, high blood pressure. And Jimmy Stewart, who is a hero of his own right, later on becoming a colonel and a general in the Air Force, but he was 5 pounds underweight at first, had to bulk up. In fact, MGM Studios gave him a personal trainer. Frank Sinatra, in a very famous case that earned him a lot of contempt from a lot of other Americans, was said to be declared 4F because of a perforated eardrum, but later on FBI files showed that he was actually disqualified because of medical psychiatric evaluations. And none other than JFK was medically disqualified from the Army due to ulcers, asthma, venereal disease, chronic back problems. So, not to worry, his dad hired a personal physician to okay him, and then he was accepted into the Navy. I'm sorry, into the Army. No, into the Navy. Thank you. Errol Flynn was also considered 4F due to various medical problems. He really wanted to get in, but heart problems, recurrent bouts of malaria, chronic back pain, chronic tuberculosis, various venereal diseases, alcoholism, the list goes on, were reasons that kept him out. But he really wanted in, not unlike my own case of being declared 4F. Back in 1940, before the war started, I was a scrawny kid from New Jersey and Brooklyn, growing up on the streets of New York and elsewhere. It so happened that I was chosen by Dr. Reinstein, who is not so subtle of a name change from Dr. Einstein, who later on we call Dr. Erskine to avoid the obvious, who creates a super soldier serum, which is injected into my veins, giving me the abilities of athleticism and brilliant strategy far beyond that of a normal man. Later on in the 1950s, it would be decided that injecting serum into veins was not considered okay to be pictured in the comic books, so it was changed to an oral supplement that I drank. But whatever the story is, it's hard for me to remember with so many revisionists. I became Captain America only after my 4F designation. I might also point out that among those who also were declared 4F was none other than Walt Disney. In World War I, he was declared 4F because he was too young. He was 16, trying to lie his way into the army. Charlie Chaplin was declared 4F after he was declared undersized. Not that it stopped critics from giving him the white feather treatment. It's an old term meaning declared a coward. And Alfred Hitchcock trying to get in during World War I. In his case, though, it wasn't undersized. And Ernest Hemingway was declared 4F because of a defective eye. So after all of these aspects of World War II woven into the history of us comic book superheroes, it probably doesn't seem like a surprise, therefore, to know that our growth after the last over 80 years worth of pop culture that we have now made possible, all due to our origins in World War II, means that nowadays the superhero movie industry has launched a new generation of learners, artists, visionaries, and dreamers. And it's not a surprise, therefore, to know that in today's world, the highest grossing movie industry of all time is the Marvel Studios owned by Disney. Right now, as a record, and I can say this with some certainty because no new movies have come out over the last 7 months, is that $22.5 billion have been made off of these movies alone, not including merchandise, and 23 movies have been made so far, which roughly accounts to let me try that again, $22.5 billion made. So $1 billion per movie is the ongoing average for what was started as a pulp serial, low maintenance, high hopes effort on the part of some Jewish kids in the slums of Cleveland over 80 years ago.
Wow.
And that is where I get to lay history to rest. And before anything else happens, I happen to be eager to ask for any questions, any interest that you might have in myself, Captain America, or in the industry, in our humble beginnings. Any questions, comments?
I got one. There was a rumor years ago that the developers of Superman were actually atheists. I mean, I realize they could have Jewish customs. Were atheists, and it was their way of putting godlike qualities on a person as kind of a slam to religion. Have you ever heard that?
So I think that just like in comic books, the ideas of religionists or atheists is similar in the same way. You can make your own interpretation as strongly as you want, and you can find the clues therein. I happen to know Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster did not declare themselves to be very Jewish, but that means that it didn't go to synagogue. They were mired in a Jewish culture. In their particular neighborhood, 80% of the people they interacted with were Jewish at all times, so it was impossible not to have Jewish trends flow into their character. They themselves wanted to distance it because, of course, at this time, when the KKK was not quite as big as it was in the 1920s with a huge batch of new immigrants coming in, but it still was very active. In fact, one of the most famous Superman stories coming out from his first 10 years was a radio broadcast serial for 16 episodes of Superman versus the Klan. And it was definitely an appeal for tolerance. In fact, Operation Tolerance was its name. And the fact that it got so much traction from pastors and rabbis, a man standing for truth against evil, could not be undigestible for men of God. They were also quick not to distance themselves from that religious aspect as well. It is true that Siegel and Shuster both created their last collaboration together after they were fired from Detective Comics was a character called Funny Man, in which they laced this James Cagney, if you know who that was. I mean, I saw his pictures growing up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, but you might not know, being a younger crowd and all. Looking like a hook-nosed, typical Jew, but sharing a lot of the Superman qualities. I think it's definitely true that people sometimes describe Einstein as being religious or not religious, depending on what quote you read him saying, and you can find both the atheism or the strong religious, and as in almost all cases, they were somewhere in the middle, celebrating Jewish holidays, wanting the Jewish culture to exist, encouraging Jewish religion, but not being bound by it, and certainly not creating a character that was depicting a character they wanted to represent the religion. Yes?
Well, now, looking forward in where we've come from and now where we're going to, with the political climate that we have today, what are your foresight of where these stories might go to? What kind of superheroes might come from this?
Well, that is the $1 billion question, right? And believe me, I've been through a lot. I've been tempted to run for president as Captain America in the 70s. Being disgusted with Watergate, I have run away from the Captain America mantle and have eventually cast off my outfit when I became nomad for a good while in the wake of Watergate. I've been killed off and come back to life through some really bad writing. I have been allowed to become an agent of the very evil organizations that I have fought against all my life through some really intense marketing schemes. And I think it is true that no matter what lies ahead for comic book heroes, we always reflect the times and events that are shaping history around us. We became a lot more focused on xenophobia and terrorism during the wake of September 11th. Not necessarily fighting against terrorists, but fighting against the fears that generated of division, of wanting people to only look after their own tribe. And I was one of those heroes who spoke against that, whether that be fighting against extreme Muslims or against our own politicians sometimes who would just use that as a power play of their own. So the years ahead, I think, are going to find ourselves increasingly more in the medium of what sells, which is in the movie industry and the TV shows. But at its core, heroes are still going to set a trend of thinking outside of just our own comfort zone and looking toward the ways in which we can be more than we were just born with. To look after conflicts that exist outside of our influence, and just like the news boys who bought at 10 cents an issue, who had no ability to fight against the Aryan philosophy or Japanese expansionist territories, but could put their support 10 cents at a time into a hero who did stand a chance of standing for something greater than they themselves could, that will always be a legacy. Yes, sir.
In World War II, though I wasn't there, but my parents tell me, and the history books tell me, that this was the time of some of the greatest unity in this country since perhaps revolutionary days. And even that, the patriots and the loyalists were quite divided. But that came as close to total unity to accomplish this goal as we've had maybe in our history. We're sort of at the opposite of that right now. Good or bad, evil is good, it doesn't matter, but fact, we are that way. Follow up on his question, how would you, channeling your creators, how would you bridge that gap? How would you, on a commercial sense, sell to both? How would you, on an ideological, sell to one and either demonize or ignore the other? What would happen?
There was a good documentary that was made of my life, fictitious of course, but it's called The Winter Soldier, Captain America 2. You've seen it.
Oh, many times.
There's a quote, which I never said in any comic, but I wished I had, which is, we cannot replace freedom with fear. During our greatest hour of need, our darkest time in world history, when totalitarian governments were ripping out the fabric of human kindness, of the chance for people to have our basic liberties upheld, there were compromises that America made in the name of unity. And we should make no bones about it. The greatest generation, I served with some of those. But I also know of the regrets that we possess, the dead from an atomic bomb, which may or may not have been needed, of the imprisonment of many of my fellow Americans, but because of their skin color, were deprived of the very freedoms that I and others were fighting for. There's never a point where it is okay to sacrifice for the few, for the benefit of the many. If anything speaks American creed, it is that simple statement. Democracy can be, as Voltaire put it once, the tyranny of the majority. That is for lesser governments. And America must always stand above that if we are to retain any semblance of moral superiority and goodness. During World War II, I would agree. Ration cards, victory gardens, the lessening of material that you would use for clothing, and the sacrificial nature of not driving alone, right? When you drive alone, you're driving with Hitler. I remember that propaganda poster back from my early days. That spirit is not as alive now. But I will say, in part, we all have the ability to rise to that occasion. I cannot help tell you how in the years before World War II, when I was just a scrawny kid living in Brooklyn, how much division I saw in the 1930s in my day, how much Democrats and Republicans were pitted against each other, how much blame was put on the backs of Herbert Hoover or Roosevelt. You're either favoring a capitalist monster or a socialist demon. And the fact that fireside chats would not relieve some of that fear, that sense of name-calling, tyranny, and blame that went on during what we call the Great Depression. It wasn't just an economic recession. It was a depression of our spirits. It was a time when kids' bellies got swollen and died from malnutrition in our own country during a dust bowl that came environmentally, but also in terms of our policies, where many of us just did not have the mindset to take after those who were our neighbors previously, but now were just strangers to us. As divisive, and maybe even more so than the time now, if we needed to. If World War III, God forbid, were ever beckoning in the decade to come, I don't doubt for a moment that the same spirit that created me and the other superheroes of the late 30s and early 40s would rise to the occasion again. You guys remember, as well as I do, standing outside of Capitol Hill on September 12th, 2001, singing God Bless America, and the American Red Cross banks being so overcrowded with people who wanted to help their fellow man, not just Americans, on the day after the attack, that October became the only month in American Red Cross history to deny people and tell them to go back home. We have too much, we can't use it all. For a moment, I don't believe that that same spirit would not be alive in a heartbeat if Americans felt and understood that we can do better than we have.
You sure don't want to run for president?
Been there, done that.
You're old enough.
Well, I hope 100 years old is old enough to run for president, minus the 17 years in a block of ice floating in the Arctic Ocean. Well, I don't want to run over time. I hope that Captain America is not accused of grandstanding. We do have, for those who are interested, a set of superhero trivia, which is mostly just for kicks, for larks, as they used to say in my 1930s. But I also know that we have a limited time on this space. And if anything, law-abiding is what I recommend this one to do.
Thank you.
That's hard to carry through your character and not mistakenly start answering for your. Yeah, you did a great job.
Well, I'm sure I don't understand what you mean by my character. Tell you about the honesty. I feel like character is a man's gift to himself or woman's. In which case, I would welcome the chance to do so. I will say that some of you have a marked advantage when it comes to superhero trivia, but there are some questions here that even I, in my hibernation from 1945 to 1963, don't even know. So I would welcome, in this case, for us to, shall we say, teams.
Probably not enough time for that, but you could just go things.
Well, I'm Captain America, so I guess I'll be able to make that executive call. So if I can just, of course, and thanks for joining us. It's because of citizens like you that we're able to keep going strong in the country. And don't forget, real heroes vote.
Will do, Cap.
Glad to hear it. So here is where you get to talk with your team at a safe 6-foot distance for the following questions, which I am honored to be able to ask, and then coming up with one joint decision among those at your group. So your group and your group. I know the gloves are a little bit difficult to maneuver, so tell me if you can't see where I'm pointing. But here is the question on my mind, and the answer comes from yours. It'll be like this. I'll ask a question, and then you'll be able to answer with one word. And I'll ask for one captain of the team. I think that sounds like it fits, to be able to answer for your entire group. So for example, Michael Jackson looked into buying Marvel Comics when they declared themselves bankrupt in the late 90s for the simple reason that he wanted to play Spider-Man in a movie. That happens to be true. It's a true fact. So I will now ask the second question. You can talk about it with your team. Here it is. Marvel published the first issue of the adaptation of Star Wars in July 1979, after the first movie came out 2 years before. So Marvel published the first issue of the adaptation of Star Wars in July 1979, 2 years after the original made their hit in theaters. True or false?
Star Wars came out in 77, so if I don't know if the issue came out in 79, but if that's true, that it came out in 79, then it would have to be 79 that it came out. So
There's a hero that I work with named Black Bolt, who has to make sure that he speaks very quietly, otherwise he can destroy entire buildings. So let that be a reminder. So
My team has,
Consensus here says false.
I say that's false.
we are at false from over here, and consensus over here.
I would think true.
Okay. And the answer is, it's false. The adaptation actually came out 2 months after the first movie, which is ridiculously fast. And I also might point out from my Agent Carter over here, what did that issue involve? Do you remember?
No.
Okay. I also had to look this up, since when I came out of deep freeze, I hadn't heard of Star Wars much, according to the movies. They had a completely different storyline than what was covered in movies 2 and 3. So it was obvious that they had not actually known what was going to be the plot. Darth Vader was not Luke's father, etc. Here's another question. See if we're going to redeem it or continue our streak. Stan Lee made me, the Marvel character, Captain America, in 1941, before America entered World War II. Stan Lee made me, the Marvel character, Captain America, in 1941, before America entered World War II. True or false?
To the restaurant.
Last time we started off over here, so consensus? Okay, we have true
I'd say false.
and we have false, and the correct answer is false again. In this case, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America, And it was before World War II, 1940s, that's correct. Yeah.
1940.
Yeah, Joe Simon.
You were punching out Adolf Hitler before.
These are tricksy questions.
They are
tricksy questions. That's not 2 years.
I mean, moral dilemmas are tricksy, and those are the kind I deal with all the time as a superhero. I will point out the next questions are actually ones you can see completely up on the screen. Ken Everett, a 16th century noble. By the way, these are all Golden Age or World War II era heroes. A 16th century noble killed by bandits for his purse, whose spirit now can possess modern day men, was an actual hero during my time in World War II. But do you know his name that he went by in the comics? You got 5 choices. Which do you think it was?
This would just be a guess. Cap, does any of the crew have to do with that text that's in the little spot there? I can't read it.
Well, you know that might be cheating if I told you, and
Okay.
I don't cheat.
That's true. You can answer the question then.
Good. Use your insight.
Yeah, I think with my glasses.
All right, so we're going to start off over here. What do you think, guys?
Go ahead. You guys pick it.
I could be right.
Gay ghost?
I may be wrong.
Yeah, go with that.
And your answer is?
The gay ghost?
All right, so we got 1 vote for number 2, and over here.
I was thinking of the gay ghost as well.
Okay. Well, you guys have your gay ghost radar up to full. He was, in fact, a gay ghost. I didn't know you guys were fans, but it's true. Looks like a Errol Flynn knockoff, if you ask me. How about this one? Robert Frank, this happens to be my favorite, bitten by a cobra, saved only by his father's injection of mongoose blood, gives him enhanced speed and strength. Which name did he go by during World War II?
I hope it's 4.
Yeah. Actually, it is. It's that, but not this one.
We're going to start off over here. Your guess?
Pretty sure it's the wizard.
Okay, we got a guess for number 4 over here. Also number 4, you guys are a whiz at this.
Is that?
Wizard
Look
is
at
right.
that.
Note to self, kids, don't inject mongoose blood into your veins. You don't end up with a mongoose speed and powers.
Well, Cap, if you go back another slide, you see the W on his helmet.
Is there a W? Oh,
Yeah.
Very good.
And the next, school teacher by day, the goddess of chastisement by night, has strength to fight skills,
Dear
or
moi.
fighting skills to fight crime. By what name was she known during World War II? Yes,
we're thinking rose red.
Rose Red for number 3, and what is our group over here think? And in this case, we have a near tie, as Lady Fairplay is correct.
Ah.
Still leads you in 1 in the lead, but fair play. Here's our last in this category. A muscular man with incredible powers who was summoned from an artifact found by an old man and his daughter. By what name did he go by in comics during World War II? Pardon me.
Hello, boys.
Number 2, Brock Atlas.
Brock Atlas, number 2 has been guessed. And our team over here,
We're going with 2 as well.
number 2 as well.
Right? Yeah.
And the correct answer is, I'm sorry, but you're all a slave to chance.
That's super slave.
Slave.
Super slave.
I
Wow.
can assure you, my creators had nothing to do with the naming of this particular Superman knockoff.
Wow.
By the way, the reason why Superman and so many others wore their underwear on the outside of their outfit rather than on the inside,
Yes.
anyone tell us why that
Wearing
is?
them over their yoga pants, yeah.
It is because when I was growing up in the 20s and 30s, if you ever saw any Charles Atlas strongmen, they would always be guys in Speedos. That was the mark of strength. So Superman adopted it right away. We'll pass by all of these since we all know that someone's allergic to spelling contests and just name the fake. So all of these are real superheroes except for one. Can you guess which one is fake? Can you name the fake? Okay, so did I hear a guess?
I'll go
The
with
sec-
Yeah.
The second one, Dynamite Thor.
Dynamite Thor, the Explosion Man is the fake. And what's your guess over here? Dynamite Thor. So, fortunately or unfortunately, the answer is Refrigerator Jackson is the fake.
Oh.
Never actually created Dynamite Thor, flying by throwing dynamite behind him. Apparently that worked in the 1940s. So,
And the dog?
and dog
And
welder
dog
is
welder?
unfortunately
Welds the dogs to people's.
not my company. Not my company. In any case, I'm informed that we're done.
That is
So
amazing.
just know that there's always more trivia and there's always more heroics. The world is ever in need of heroes, and you can be one too.
Ross, you're amazing.
Yeah, good job.
Super.
And thank you to those who came at the last minute, saved the day, and made possible the guesswork for our larger trivia game. Hopefully, you enjoyed what you learned.
Would you take your shield off again?
You wouldn't believe how many villains have asked me that over the years.
All right.
I have a picture of my wife holding hands with Captain America, by the way.
Really?
Do you know Ross? Or did you?
I
Oh,
work
okay.
with
Oh, okay.
Him do a
Well,
presentation.
that's what I'm thinking of. I hope people don't think this is our church
Something on
service.
the Kennedy assassination.
Of
Yesterday
course,
was
by
a
all means.
crash.
In which case,
Can we
stay
just
safe,
walk
remember,
by?
vote responsibly. and do everything. Oh, by all means.
Yeah, because
We're
I
like
think
twins.
this is our church
Look at that.
service.
Very impressive.
We work together, and we
Would you like
work
to?
with club together.
On any other day, I'm sure we would be able
We
to
both have a big thing.
do the sign vote.
So
We'll wait for,
I'm glad you could
more
join us. It's
opportune
really
days.
nice. So Ross had the idea. Why doesn't everybody just volunteer to do something, presentation of some sort?
Good, I'm
So
showing
on
my breath.
Monday,
Me too.
that's